Question: what about so-called Christian music such as Patricia White sings? I don't know her, and I'm afraid that I have to confess, it's not claim, it's confess ignorance about most of the singers of our day. I think that if you've been trained in music as I was, and trained to appeal to the thoughts and the feelings of people as I was trained, I think that you will find that there is not much in music nowadays that you can really feel happy about entirely. Now you might say, well, what about the scripture songs? Well, yes, the scripture songs are fine, except that sometimes they're not really music. They're just words set to tones. Not really good music. What we need is some really good music for the scripture songs. There are two things that a song must have in order for it to be appropriate. One thing is that the words should stand alone and mean something without the music. And you know that much of rock is just the same words or the same phrase repeated maybe 20 or 30 times. So the words do not stand alone without the music to make it go. Then the music should stand alone without the words. Now here is where some scripture songs don't quite hold up, is that the music is not very appealing without the words. And in order to be really good music, it has to have both of those. So I think that we would need to condemn this just based on that. Somebody's going to ask me, what about discordant music that we sometimes have? And sometimes things will end on an off note, like this kind of thing, and that's the end of it. That's the end of the song. It's a little bit unrestful to have that kind of thing. So it should always end on a major dominant note. Now another area that I have a great concern is that of music. In our day, most music that you can hear almost anywhere is music that it would be better if we didn't hear it, wouldn't it? Now, some of you have been trained rather extensively in music, along with myself. During my young life, music was probably the biggest single thing, and a time finally had to come in my experience where I faced the thought of a career in medicine or a career in music. And my first cousin, who lived next door to me, she and I played duets, keyboard duets, quite a lot. And it was her dream, and at times I shared that with her, that she and I would become musicians together and play piano duets. And we felt that it sounded pretty good when we played together. And we either were good or we were pretty stupid, because sometimes we spent hours every day, weeks on end, practicing. And we either did get pretty good or there was something basically very wrong with us. Most of the time we played classical things or popular things. That was before the days when everybody was listening to jazz. Blues were very common, and we sometimes played those. Out of jazz grew rock, and rock has now its various features. Not all rock is discordant and unpleasant to hear. Some of you may have heard some rock concerts that had some beautiful music in it. Is beauty that thing that makes us judge whether music is appropriate for us to hear? And immediately we know that it isn't. Some classical music is very beautiful, and yet it brings up into the mind thoughts that tend toward separating one from Christ. Now, many people, when you talk about music, it falls very definitely on deaf ears. If something sounds good, they're willing to listen to it. If it doesn't sound good, then they're willing to call it bad music. So it's either good or bad, depending on whether they like to hear it. But there is much music that isn't good for us to hear. Now, again, let's go back to what character is. What are the two parts of character? Thoughts and feelings. So when you hear one thing, one type of music, and it gives you a thought, you can know that a feeling is coming on afterward. And just to give you an example of how this kind of thing would work, let me just play a couple of bars of something for you so that you can see how this works. Do you know what kind of thoughts you had or feelings? Did any of you feel patriotic? Well, maybe you could have, because that's a march. And we think of bands and marching in terms of patriotism, and you might have felt that. It might have stimulated you to have that kind of thought and that kind of feeling when you hear that kind of music. Now let's take another kind of music, and this time I'll only give you a single chord. But see what kind of thought you have from this. It was altogether different from the last music, wasn't it? The first was bright. This was not bright. What kind of thought did you have from that second one? Gloom and death and despair. This is a dominant major. That's a finished chord. You can be happy with that chord. You're not expecting anything more from that. But what about this one? What kind of feeling do you get from that one? It was discordant. You were not happy with it. It was music. It was not music. It was really more like noise, wasn't it? Anything that has cacophony and noise irritates the mind and makes it so that it's you're not happy with that. Then two notes played together like this. That too is unfinished. It's unpleasant. It's not entirely pleasant. And that makes you expect something more. Then something like this. That's a pleasant chord, but it's not finished, is it? It needs something to follow it, like that, or like that. Now, I'm sure that by these very simple illustrations, you can see that music can stimulate different thoughts and different feelings. At any time that you're listening to music, character is being built. It is being built by both those thoughts that you have and those feelings that you have. Many people in our day have depression, unrest, restlessness, excitement, and not just young people, but people of any age can think after hearing music that they were oblivious that they were actually hearing music. But when they have heard it, that person may think, well, I feel a certain excitement, or I feel some unrest, or I am irritated. All of these may come to the mind because of the music that one has heard. What one person might deem to be perfectly possible for the mind to hear without separating from Jesus, another person hearing the very same music would have to say, that music does something to me that I don't like. Most people feel that, or many people who have been musically trained, feel that classical music is fine. And I think that probably Christians who have grown up with classical music probably have the feeling that classical music is fine. But if you studied music and studied the lives of the composers, studied the conditions under which they composed many of the classical pieces that we often play as background music for some of our functions, our public functions, thinking that it's perfectly good music, when you study the circumstances under which the music was composed, you recognize that it was not at all pure, and that you would be far better off not hearing it. It stimulates even when you don't want it to or don't think about it. It can stimulate the mind to certain thoughts and certain feelings, just as those single chords that I played for you would give you a certain sensation or certain thoughts. Music is very important. Some years ago, we decided that there was at least certain classical music that we would not hear in our home anymore, nor would we play those pieces on musical instruments. And it was quite a large stack of records and sheet music, and books of music that we decided to get rid of at the time that we began to realize that all classical music is not of itself of a good nature. Now, there is no subject that I have ever spoken on that I think brings more varied opinions than the subject of music. And if you disagree with me, maybe the Lord is speaking to you in a different way. But if somebody is very fanatical about music, and they won't listen to certain types of music that you know for you are all right, you should keep your tongue silent about their opinions about music, because you don't know what thoughts and feelings the same music that you may find elevating, they find very debasing to their souls. And when people tell you that they would prefer that certain types of music not be played, respect that and avoid those kinds of music, because we are indeed our brother's keepers, aren't we? I don't believe that we have finished by any means the topic of music. There's much more that could be said, but I'd like to leave the burden of studying out that matter with you so that you can decide for yourself what things you would allow and what things you would not allow.
Now, another part of recreation is something that has both a blessing and a curse, and that is music. I have just read a book by Dr. Eurydice Osterman, who is the head of music at the Department of Music at Oakwood College. Dr. Osterman has written a book called What God Says About Music, and I have enjoyed reading that. And as I read it, I thought about the large place that music has in the earth made new. I'm sure that God will teach us all sorts of things, like how to play a harp. Apparently we will have that innate knowledge. We will not have to be taught. We will be simply issued the harp, and immediately we will be able to play. What a joy that will be, a very challenging instrument. But we will also sing. The human voice is the most beautiful musical instrument on earth, and singing can be a great blessing to us. But there is that about music that can also be a curse, and Dr. Osterman talks about that in her book on music, about how the physical body is affected by the kind of music that we listen to. Much of this kind of music we will find in the mass media today, in radio and in television, and we recommend to you that you learn that kind of music that can be damaging to your psychological makeup and to your physical body, and that you avoid that kind of music. With television, there are also some other dangers that we should mention. One is that the flicker of television requires a certain time span because of the fact that the eye has to unite those flickers into one steady image, and making that flicker synthesis requires a certain amount of time. Then when you receive the image into the eye, after that flicker synthesis is done, then it must be passed to the back of the head, where we have the visual cortex, way back here in the back of the head. That doesn't take long, but it does take a split second. And then not only must we receive it there in the visual cortex, but then we must transfer it to another area, which is an interpretation area, another split second. Then we have to transfer it to yet another area where we synthesize all of these aspects of what has gone on in the brain, so that we can send the composite picture to the judgment center of the brain. In the judgment center, we criticize what we have seen. Now, television does not give us enough time to criticize what we have seen. All of these steps take a little bit of time. Once we get to the judgment center, then it isn't possible for us to take the time with commercial TV to evaluate what we see in commercial TV. Now, you will observe that 3ABN broadcasts its programs in an altogether different way. The flicker is the same. All the things that happen in the brain are the same, except for what happens in the judgment center. You're given plenty of time to make a judgment about what I have said or others have said, so that you can see if that is moral or immoral, if it agrees with your religion or it does not agree, if it's offensive to your sensibilities or it's not offensive. All of that takes time. Commercial TV does not give you that time. I consider that to be a very difficult problem with commercial TV, and one of the reasons why parents should be extremely careful with television. So far as I'm concerned, a child does not need to see television. They can watch 3ABN. It's not commercial TV, and they will be much edified by watching 3ABN. There are some aspects of television that Don Miller will talk with you about, and perhaps at this time he will say a few words about that.
I'd like to say a few words about that because things have changed since I was a child. I was born in 1947. 1950s was the year of the television came out, and things were on television back then, which I consider even today to be rather innocent. I mean, I grew up with Beaver Cleaver. I grew up with Ozzie and Harriet. I grew up with these very simple family situations. But things have changed. There's been a whole paradigm shift, as it were, to today's television programming. And I don't watch television anymore. I do not have a TV. I have not had TV for years. But I hear about what's going on these TVs. I read in newspapers. I read about that guy named Beavis and his friend. I read about Married with Children. And all these things, the very programming is meant to change a person's whole mindset. Even going back to the detectives and the dramas back in my youth, you had the things like Highway Patrol and programs like that. You never saw blood and guts flying. You never saw the violence that you see nowadays in programs on the television. And so I've even forgotten the name of the programs back then. That's good. Things are getting better in my mind. But we see that as programming changes, well, they've done some studies. They've gone to places where they've never had television, and finally they've gotten TV in. And as soon as TV is introduced to a society, they find a number of things. One, homicides go up, delinquency goes up, attitudes of children in schools down as low as the first and second grades go down. In South Africa, for years, the homicide rate had been falling, and then TV was introduced. And as soon as TV was introduced, for the next 15 years, it went up precipitously. Now, it's interesting to look at the time in which TV was introduced in South Africa and how much it rose, and take the same period of time for TV introduced into the United States, and the rise in crime was much lower in the United States. Why was it lower in the U.S. than it was in South Africa? Are they different? Were they created by a different God? No, because when TV was created or introduced into the United States back in the 50s, the programming was quite innocent and family-oriented. But when TV was introduced in 1975 in South Africa, programming at that time had become quite violent, quite perverted, if I can use that word. And it changed the people, because what you view, what you behold, is what you become. And so if you want to become a Beavis, watch Beavis. If you want to become like Christ, observe him. Observe him in the Word. Observe him in nature. And because one of these days, we're going to be like him if we allow him to make us that way, Dr. Thrash.